Good evening, everyone. I'm Rupert Taylor-Price, and I'm the CEO and founder of Vault Systems. So today I'm going to talk you through essentially the Australian landscape for government cloud and what we've been doing with OpenStack here within Australia for government cloud. And so what Vault Systems does is we essentially run an OpenStack IaaS cloud, both here in Sydney, as well as we have a region in Canberra. And we specialize in hosting sensitive government information, as well as classified systems for the federal, state, and local government here. And so I'll talk you through, I guess, a lot of the regulatory framework and I guess the challenges of rising to the security challenge that we have in Australia. But before I talk about that, I wanted to talk about, I guess, our ethos about how we do work and how we operate within the community here in Australia. And I was in Tasmania, which is about 1,000 kilometres south of here, about 2 months ago, where I met Bill Lark. And Bill Lark really captured for me, I guess, a way of doing business that I really think resonates with the OpenStack community. So Bill Lark started a distillery for whiskey called Sullivan's Cove, which really a few years ago pretty much no one in the world would have heard of until he got announced as having the world's best whiskey, taking an accolade that's been given to Scotland for, well, as long as I can remember. And so the way that Bill achieved this, he actually started not only his own distillery, but he went around and mentored and helped 14 other distilleries in the area, set them up from scratch, gave them the equipment, helped them with funding, taught and educated all of them, so that he had a community that he could work off with to bounce ideas around, to have someone challenge his way of thinking on what he was doing. And there's just simply no way that without that support and ecosystem and industry that he would have been able to build a company that was able to produce the world's best whiskey. So I see that very much in the cloud sense as well, and the OpenStack community sharing, and even the greater community beyond OpenStack as well. So what we've done is really contribute quite a lot to those around us in the cloud space in government, and we're sort of building something together within that community to try and support the security and sovereignty of Australians' data. So I thought I'd tell you a couple of other things as well around, I guess, how cloud works in government. So today, the federal government spends less than 1% of their ICT budget on cloud. So it's quite a small market if you think about what they're spending in total. And so the federal budget currently in Australia is around $9 billion. Obviously, all the states have budgets as well, which adds up in total to a larger market. And a small sliver of that is going to cloud computing at the moment. So really, as cloud providers, our competitors are not each other. They're not the other cloud providers. They're the legacy systems, the legacy way of doing business in government that we have today. And so really, as a community, as cloud providers, we really need to educate government to do that. And of course, getting into the game of providing highly secure systems into any country is really quite a challenging feat to achieve. So one of the things I wanted to really cover is, what does government actually do as a whole with data? And so you really got to then break it down into a few areas and then decide which of those areas you're going to specialize and focus on. So you've got public information, and a lot of people don't think about this section of data for government. So like a bus timetable, that's government data. It sits somewhere, it resides somewhere. The security requirements on it are not that high, but you also don't want it to be edited. And there's obviously a lot of information like bus timetables where you don't want the information to be edited, but if the information goes public, especially in a bus timetable, it doesn't really matter. It's already in the public domain. And so really that's obviously a great use case for public clouds, and there's really little requirement there. The next one, and this is a really big thing that government does, is it looks after citizens' data. Citizens place a lot of trust in their governments where they place their data. And probably the last one, which is probably more of a niche area, is where government looks after national security, so defense and intelligence in these spaces. And so if you think about those three things, that's really, in a broad sense, the totality of what government does. And each of those sections has a really a different story in cloud. And so where we focus on as a company is citizen information and national security data. And we've had sort of banks approach us and ask us, hey, we want this same level of security for our banking environments. And they actually don't really need it. Whilst a bank losing information is still very bad for the bank, ultimately it's not that sensitive information from a personal information point of view compared to what government holds. And also, if money is lost, it can simply be replaced by an insurance claim or more money. If you look at what happens when a government fails to secure data, the consequences of that are far more catastrophic. People lose faith in their government overall. And if you look at, say, social security records, if you've got a citizen that's then disclosed through a social welfare program, events that happen to them in their life, potentially child abuse or something when they were younger, and that information goes public, even just one record, let alone on aggregate, the consequences just cannot be replaced simply by providing some sort of financial compensation to that person. So the risk profile that government is under and the fear of failure and the risk is very different. And so you really then need to address that with the systems that you build and how you do it. So ultimately, government then classifies data. And I've taken a little bit of an artistic license on classifications here to try and, I guess, draw out some of the key differences. So public bus timetables and that sort of thing are unclassified data. Then there's data called unclassified DLM, which is dissemination limiting marker. This is quite common, especially across Five Eyes countries. And so that's essentially, if you imagine a contract's been negotiated between two parties, it's commercially sensitive, it's not unclassified, it's not for public consumption, it is restricted information, but it's not sensitive in the fact that it's got personal information where citizen information is in there. And so generally for that kind of data, you either don't need a security clearance as an individual to see it, or in some cases you would need a baseline security clearance. So the next one, which is really where we focus on, is the unclassified DLM sensitive information. So this is like aggregate tax records, social security records, and that sort of thing. And in nearly all cases, you would then need a baseline security clearance to have access to that. And then you get into what is the more serious stuff. So generally, as you go down this stack, the requirements increase quite rapidly. So protected information is essentially where it's of some sort of national significance to keep that data secure. And so typically you would see, in most cases, what we've experienced is an NV1 security clearance, which is a negative vetting 1. And then as you go further into that stack, you start getting into manners of national security, defense and intelligence and that sort of thing. So as you go down through that stack, the requirements placed on an organization to hold that information go up, as well as the requirements for security clearances. So when we looked at that, there were two things there. So there's DLM data, which is restricted from dissemination, and then there's also sensitive data as well. And so the way it works in the Australian government is you've got an organisation within the Department of Defence called the Australian Signals Directorate, and they're really focused on security. That's all they care about, the security of the data. But then there's another section within the Australian government, it's disaggregated, it's decentralised management, is the privacy of that data. So you can't, the security that's then managed by ASD really doesn't take into consideration the privacy and the legal requirements around each individual. It's the agency, the end government agency, that then needs to assess that. And around the world, you've got I guess a varying attitude towards privacy, but generally in the Western world, it's quite a strong one, particularly Europe, the United States. And then you can see here that the Information Commissioner a few months ago did a survey across Australia and found that 93% of Australians expected their data to be managed in some sort of a sovereign way. So what does sovereignty mean? So sovereignty means different things to different people. I think if you take a look at its simplest form, which is one that we don't particularly subscribe to, it simply means that the data centre is within Australia, for Australia's case. The reality of sovereignty is it's much more complicated. It comes down to the legal ownership of that business, the supply chain of who supplies that business. So you can, for instance, have a data center based in Australia, but the support could have a follow the sun support model, and then it's essentially supported out of numerous countries. You've then got supply chains servicing that organization, which again has a whole load of risks associated with it about being managed in other geographical locations. So one of the challenges with cloud that we find within the general public is the association with cloud is generally associated with a loss of control. Data has gone somewhere into some system and it's transiting in some way around the world, whether that's the core data itself or the metadata or the management of that system. And so in Australia, there's generally a low trust in cloud to date. And we also see that's then reflected through the bureaucracy of government as well, where there's currently a low degree of trust. And I'll talk to you about how the government's been addressing that. So the other two sort of key things that happened in the last few years in Australia as well is Malcolm Turnbull announced the cloud first policy. So he mandated that everything should move to the cloud. There's a few conditions to that, but they're pretty liberal. Other than security. Security is really the one that's held everything back. And then the government's also put in an open standards and an open source policy requirement. I think it was back in 2012, and it recently got ratified in a recommendation to government. So hopefully you can start to see already how OpenStack really can start to fit in to solve this problem in this space. So historically, before Vault started and the previous business I worked for, we didn't use OpenStack. We've been using OpenStack in Vault since about 2011. OpenStack in 2011 was a reasonably immature product. It was a challenging beast to manage. The reason we chose OpenStack back in that time when it was a challenge to support it. The ability for us to control the source code, to re-engineer the core security components of OpenStack to natively meet government security requirements were really the key for us. So if you think about how that works in a cloud environment, we've got a policy unit coming out of the Australian Signals Directorate and the Attorney Generals, and each year these policy requirements change. And we don't know what our policy requirements are going to be next year. So there'll be something called the Information Security Manual and the Protective Security Policy Framework. And next year the requirements of that could change, and we're expected to be able to adapt the way we operate to then comply to that. So you can see if you start taking multiple proprietary technologies or proprietary products and putting them together, not only are you typically operating them in a way where they weren't intended for this particular use case, but you've also got a changing environment where you've got to adapt to that, and the vendors typically won't support you through that journey. So what does that result in terms of, obviously in our case, a secure cloud, which is a government community cloud. We only service government, commercial clients. Like if you guys wanted today as a commercial or a citizen to log on and get access to our cloud, you can't. You need a sponsorship through government to do that, versus a public cloud, obviously, where you can just go and use that service immediately. So we've got a security operations center that monitors that. Of course, public clouds have a security operations center as well. But what they're really monitoring is the integrity of that core system, whereas we're really looking at the perimeter as well as the core system, as well as the actions of each of those government agencies as well. So we're then monitoring all of that as well. And you can't turn security off. All the security components in there are baked on by default, rather than you having to buy that service and then implement them all. One common misconception is we have a unclassified DLM cloud and a protected cloud, and a common misconception is that people think that we got a security rating up to protected. A protected cloud and an unclassified DLM cloud are actually two physically separate things, and they're actually air-gapped from each other. And they're joined in two ways. They have a secure internet gateway that communicates between them, as well as they have a cross-domain gateway that then allows data to go between different security domains. So it's really quite a fundamentally different product to a public cloud. And I'll go through a bit later some of the frameworks and how we've addressed that there. So one of the challenges I guess we have as well, again back to that community aspect, is when there's ever a security incident within government, it tends to actually slow down cloud adoption for us. So last year we had an issue with our census where it went offline for a number of days. It was actually a legacy environment. It had nothing to do with the cloud. And what we experienced was negative pushback around cloud technology after that had happened, because there's just an aversion to risk and change that was heightened around that time. And then last week we had 50,000 records get compromised from an AWS cloud. Again, you would think logically people would then be driven towards secure cloud. They would say, well, public cloud is not fit for this purpose and secure cloud is the right solution to that, and we would get an influx of business. But actually what we tend to see is actually a nervousness about technology change overall, and so all incidents around government and security compromises tend to slow us down. So how does Australia fit in a global sense? So there's obviously a lot of frameworks out there from a lot of countries, but I thought I'd highlight two. So the USA has got a FedRAMP program, which I won't go into the detail of, but it's quite an onerous and significant program and process to get through. And then in the United Kingdom, they have more of a marketplace, something where you can get onto the lists and start doing business in theory with government within a couple of months. And so Australia's really got a mix of these two things. We do have a cloud marketplace. There's about 150 vendors in Australia. It used to be the Department of Finance that managed it. It's now the Digital Transformation Agency. And we also have the ASD CCSL, which is essentially the certified cloud list for security. So at the unclassified space, there's about 8 providers, and at the protected space, there's 3 providers. So if you look at sort of the global thing, and the reason I picked these two, is Australia is really a mix of the two. From a security point of view, from ASD, they follow that US-style FedRAMP broadly framework, and then from a procurement and consumption point of view, they're following more of that UK model. And so the advantages and disadvantages of the two is the FedRAMP and the ASD CCSL model. They're very onerous. It was a 6-year process for us to go through and work with ASD to get our cloud certified for protected information. They look at deep sections of the cloud, from how you manage keys, cryptography, how you do data segregation, how data flows through your networks, and it's truly a significant and onerous process to go through. And then you've got the UK process where you can get onto a government cloud panel very quickly, but then when you go and work with an individual government agency in the UK, they have no faith in the whole of government system, so you've then got to do in a bespoke and disjointed way, prove to them that based on their use case of their agency, you have the right security requirements in place. So my quite strong preference is the Australian model. I think it is the better model of those two, because what you provide is a very high assurance and trust in those services to each of those government agencies, which over time should have better consumption rates. Because if you ultimately don't trust the cloud, even if it's easy to procure, then I think in the long term you won't see a large adoption in the cloud space. So probably one thing to add to that is the challenge with this in Australia particularly, especially for the larger public cloud providers, is the Australian market is quite limited. We've got 22-ish million people, say compared to the US or Europe, where they're much larger markets. The challenge then is to have a large ecosystem of providers is quite challenging, because the investment required to meet a high security standard for a limited market is a challenging one to convince investors to go through that journey of. So you typically, I think, in a country the size of Australia, probably end up with fewer vendors, but I still believe that higher trust model is the right model. So what have we built? This is a very, very high-level diagram. Unfortunately, I really struggle to get permission from the government to release publicly a lot of the details about what we do, including the projects we've worked on. I tried to have a whole load of use cases from defence and intelligence for the projects we've actually delivered and worked on in this space, but unfortunately I was quite flatly denied the ability to talk about those things. So as I said before, there's a secure internet gateway, not depicted here as a cross-domain gateway. The Sydney region and and the Canberra region, and then essentially 2 air-gapped clouds. So they are actually, from an OpenStack perspective, the Canberra unclassified cloud is a region, and the Canberra protected cloud is a region as well. So they have entirely separate servers as well. So Keystone, Horizon, and all of those things are all segregated as well and run individually for each of those security domains. Probably one thing we did achieve, which was pretty amazing, is the deployment of a new region for us with all of those security controls in place is a fully automated process, which made it really easy for us to prove to auditors that we were compliant to that, because we could destroy and rebuild things and deploy that all in an automated way, which is pretty common obviously in OpenStack now, but when we first launched it, it was a little less common. So I'll talk you through why OpenStack is the right tool. So as I said, we've been using OpenStack since about 2011, and those changing security requirements really undermined our ability to use any other tool. If we took any other tool into that process and we had a changing set of security requirements, and with this bit of text at the bottom, I'll talk you through an example of that, those changing security requirements really made it impossible for us to have any certainty about the longevity of our business. So we could be putting in a very substantial financial infrastructure investment in place, and then in 2 years' time not be compliant to security requirements and no longer be able to do business with the government. So that was an incredible risk for us if we were to go down a proprietary technology road. The ability in OpenStack, again, to rewrite security modules. So the way, because there's obviously technology in government before cloud, and these security requirements, by the way, one of them at the bottom from the ISM, a security control there, it's actually the same security controls for legacy infrastructure and cloud. There's not a special set of standards for cloud. What the government done is had a consistent framework of security across legacy infrastructure and cloud at the same time. So the ability to then rewrite security modules within OpenStack is key to us, because the way it works in a legacy environment is you tend to put these proprietary environments in, and then you put security layers around, and you start to put security middleware between sections of the system, and it becomes unwieldy and impossible to manage. For us to natively be able to build to the security requirement was one of the key things we needed. High performance, native compliance as well. High performance, so the ability to specify a cloud in the way that we wanted it to work. So we run 100 gigabit networks to the node. Our first 2 tiers of storage are all NVMe. We have connected into a government network called ICON, which is a network that's able to provide many terabits of data throughput. The ability to build into that, connect into government systems, and allow government to have scale-up applications as well as scale-out at the same time. That was critical as well. The interoperability. So this is one of the amazing things that we've found in OpenStack, is you'll have a vendor like SAP or Oracle, and somewhere around the world they will have deployed their environment, and there's many other examples, for a specific government somewhere else. And then they come to Australia and they don't want to remake that investment. And so the ability for them to take that same blueprint and for it to work seamlessly, and I mean, as you would all experience, like a less than 10-minute deployment of those new systems into those environments has been absolutely key in bringing on those partners, getting those technologies into this sovereign cloud. And open standards, again, perhaps a specific thing for Australia, but the Australian government does mandate the use of open standards, so the ability for that to go through and meet those requirements as well. So one of the things I wanted to talk through here is a very specific security control. And I want you to imagine 2 things when I talk this through. One is the ability of how would you do this in a proprietary product, and 2, how would you do this on a public cloud, or how would a public cloud provider do this, bearing in mind they're not going to want to implement this security control just for Australia. They're probably going to want to include it in their total build process globally. So control 359, there's about 1,500 controls in the ISM, about 938 of them are active and relevant for us at the moment. And so you can see here this control applies to unclassified DLM, protected, confidential, secret, and top secret, and it's a must, which means it's not an optional one. We can't sign off on the risk, it has to be done. So agencies must sanitize non-volatile flash media by overwriting the media at least twice with a random pattern followed by a readback for verification. So we're essentially creating noise on the disk, creating a hash of that noise, and then reading that back. So obviously within the various OpenStack components such as Ceph and Cinder, we're able to then natively add modules in that go and after someone terminates an instance, right through and kick off that process. It's not commercially viable to do that in a public cloud. The cost of the resource that goes and runs that, someone spins something up for 10 minutes and then spins it back down, and we may go and spend the next 2 hours scrubbing that data off of those disks. So you can start to see that's one of a sort of 1,000 controls, and the ability to natively deliver that within OpenStack versus if you were on a more of a proprietary but non-public cloud. The reality of that is you typically go to the data center, and some of our competitors would operate in this way. You take that disk out, you have a register, you fill in a form, you plug it into another computer that does that essentially follows this process before it's reprovisioned to another use case for another agency. So you can just start to see how impractical, whilst these security requirements are absolutely critical for the security of the data, as a cloud provider, they're very impractical and very hard to deal with. And really it was OpenStack's ability to deliver to that which really made it amazing for us. Cool, so that's the end of the formal presentation. If any of you guys have got any questions, happy to answer them. And then after that, I've got a couple of announcements to go through. Cool. Yep.
You were saying that that was a requirement, that last control is a requirement for certification. So given that AWS and Azure have unclassified DLM certification, how do they deal with that?
So it's a risk-based approach. So even though it said, so if I go back to that slide, so it's a risk-based approach, and you can see there's an authority there, and so that authority is then delegated to different parts of government, and so they can essentially then take a risk-based approach, and it depends then on the classification of data for where that risk is done. So Vault Systems, we basically took the community edition of OpenStack, we then modified components of that, and we then took that through that process. So Vault Systems has 0 non-compliances with the ISM, so we meet every single control that's relevant to us. My understanding is that we're the only provider that has no non-compliances, and so the challenge, and so say you miss 1 or 2 of them, despite it being a must, the government does take a risk-based approach and then sometimes sign off on some of those. The problem is with the public clouds, these exceptions fall into the hundreds. And so a really good example of that, for instance, is for us to have administrative access to protected information, our staff need an NV1 security clearance. For a public cloud provider to globally provide NV1 security clearances from domestic staff, you start to get, you just start to amass a number of non-compliance to those controls, and then that risk profile grows, and then that agency won't sign off that risk, or in this case ASD, but historically it used to be the individual agency. And they still can, an agency can still make an exception and sign off a risk if it chooses to for a specific use case. Cool, any other questions? Cool, all right, so some pretty, some pretty exciting announcements today. We, if you read the AFR this morning, you'd already know some of them. We've, through the last 18 months, as I said, it's very challenging to be in this space and get people to commit the kinds of capital required to deploy large amounts of infrastructure out into government. This morning it was announced that we successfully concluded a transaction with an Australian investment bank called Moelis Australia, and they will be investing into this space with us over the next few years. And so the total quantum of that investment that Vault Systems will be making into government infrastructure will be $350 million by July 2020. So we are putting a very substantial amount of resource and committing into government. I think one of the challenges that government has had with us, as exciting as we were and as innovative as we were, they were very worried about our longevity and how we were going to continue to grow and develop through that period. So that's a pretty amazing result for us, and we're very happy to have Moelis come along and support us through that journey. And then that was about an 18-month journey to secure that funding. It was not an easy road. We went through a lot of twists and turns on the way. So it's a pretty major milestone for us here today. And the next one is then we also had a number of board members join as well. So Jane Holton, who was the former Secretary of Finance, joined our board. I guess would be at the end of last week, as well as Dennis Richardson, who was the former Secretary of Defence in Australia, and Paul Moy, who used to be the Head of Infrastructure and Asset Management at UBS as well. So we kind of, the history of the company really is we were an R&D company originally. We put a lot of time and energy into building that. We then went through a massive certification process. About 2.5 years ago, we were certified for unclassified information. In April of this year, we were the first cloud to be allowed to hold classified information as aggregate in a cloud environment, and that's then obviously gone on to trigger what is an incredibly sizable investment for us to be able to invest into the Australian federal government. And there were a couple of other announcements, but I didn't get sign-off on putting them out today, so sorry about that. Cool, all right. Well, thank you much for coming, and obviously, thanks very much for Melbourne Cup Day as well. So cheers, thank you.